Welcome to Math with Mr. J.
In this video, I'm going to go through an introduction to congruent figures. So what are congruent figures? Well, simply put, congruent figures are figures with the same shape and same size. Basically, they are perfect matches. If you slid one figure over the other, they would match up perfectly. Let's take a look at some examples to better understand this. Starting with number 1, where we need to figure out if the two figures are congruent or not for A, B, and C. Let's start with A right here. So do those rectangles look to be congruent? Are they the same shape and same size? Yes, they are congruent. If we slid one rectangle over the other, they would match exactly. So yes, these rectangles are congruent. Moving on to B, do those triangles look to be congruent? Are they the same shape and same size? Same shape, yes, but same size, no. So these triangles are not congruent. Taking a look at C now, are those two rectangles congruent? Well, they do look like they are the same shape and size, but if we start with the rectangle on the left and then look at the rectangle on the rectangle on the right has been rotated. It's been turned. So if we slid the rectangle on the right on top of the rectangle on the left, would they match up perfectly? No, they wouldn't. But what if both rectangles were turned the same way? Would they line up perfectly then? Because all that matters here is if they are the same shape and same size. The orientation of the figures, so how they are positioned, doesn't impact if the figures are congruent. So when we ask ourselves, are these rectangles congruent, we're looking for the same shape and same size. And yes, they are the same shape and same size. So they are congruent. And let's actually rotate the rectangle on the right so it's like the rectangle on the left. Now we can really tell that these two rectangles are congruent. So yes, these rectangles are congruent. Let's move on to some more examples. Taking a look at our other examples here, let's take a look at numbers 2 through 5, where we need to determine if the two figures are congruent or not. Let's start with number 2, where we have two triangles. So are these triangles congruent? Are they the same shape and same size? No. So these triangles are not congruent. Right away, we can tell that they are not the same shape. So no, these triangles are not congruent. Moving on to number 3, we have two pentagons. The pentagons are the same shape and they are the same size. So yes, these pentagons are congruent. Moving on to number 4, we have two hexagons. And the hexagons are the same shape, but they're different sizes. So no, they are not congruent. For number 5, we have two triangles, and they are the same shape and size. But we can see going from the left triangle to the one on the right, the triangle has been flipped or reflected. Basically, imagine flipping the triangle on the left over this dashed line like a page in a book. And you can kind of picture that flip. This doesn't impact the triangles being congruent though. These triangles are still the same shape and size. So yes, they are congruent. Lastly, let's move on to number 6, where we have triangle ABC. So I'm naming that triangle by the vertices and going around in order. Again, triangle ABC, and then we have triangle XYZ. And for this one, we're going to take this a step further. For numbers 1 through 5, we went off of how the figures looked and determined if they were congruent. We didn't have any side lengths labeled, angles labeled, or markings on any of the figures. For number 6, these triangles look congruent, but we're going to include some markings that will help us in geometry, and specifically, they will help us determine if these triangles are congruent. Remember, same shape, same size. That means all of the side lengths need to be the exact same and all of the angles need to be the exact same. Let's include the markings. So now we have tick marks on the sides and arcs on the inside of the triangles by the angles. The tick marks show which sides have the same length, and the arcs show which angles have the same measure. So let's check if all of the sides and angles are the same for both triangles. Let's start with the angles. We have one arc for angle A right here, and one arc for angle X right here. That tells us that these angles are congruent. They have the same measure. Moving on to angle B and angle Y, we can see that those two angles have two arcs. That tells us that those two angles are congruent. They have the same measure. And then lastly for the angles, angle C and angle Z have three arcs. And since they both have three arcs, that tells us that those angles are congruent. They have the same measure. Next, let's move on to all of the sides. And we will start with the sides with one tick mark. So side length AB right here and side length XY. That one tick mark on each tells us that those sides are congruent. The sides have the same length. Next, let's look at the sides with two tick marks. So side length BC and side length YZ. Those two tick marks on each of those side lengths tells us that those side lengths are congruent. They have the same length. And then lastly, we have three tick marks on side length AC and three tick marks on side length XZ. Those three tick marks on each tells us that those sides are congruent. They have the same length. So looking at both of those triangles and the arcs and tick marks, all of the angles and side lengths are the same. So these triangles are congruent. Same shape, same size. And we're actually going to write this out a little more officially here for number 6. We can write this out as triangle ABC is congruent to, and that's the symbol for congruent right there, by the way, triangle XYZ. So there you have it. There's an introduction to congruent figures. I hope that helped. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, peace.